Independence, Missouri. The quiet streets of this suburban neighborhood were always peaceful. It was the kind of place where people didn't lock their doors, where neighbors would greet each other on their morning walks, and where life seemed to move at a slower pace. Louise Dickey, a 63-year-old woman, had lived in her modest home on East 27th Street for years. Her life had been one of simplicity, joy, and independence. Despite the physical limitations caused by a severe car accident years ago, Louise maintained a cheerful disposition, her ever-present smile the hallmark of her character. Louise had once worked in accounting in Kansas City, but after her accident, she was left with injuries that made even the simplest tasks difficult. She couldn't walk long distances, couldn't carry anything heavier than 5 pounds, and was heavily dependent on pain medication. But none of that seemed to change her attitude. Louise was known to be kind-hearted, generous, and deeply grateful for the help she received from her daughter Miranda and her neighbor Barbara. Miranda, who lived nearby, would visit her mother weekly, bringing not just supplies but company, and keeping an eye on Louise's 3 cats, Chloe, Monkey, and Reba, the latter named after her favorite singer, Reba McEntire. Music was Louise's refuge. She would spend hours sitting in her cozy living room, listening to records, completely immersed in the world of melodies and lyrics that comforted her. Kevin, her best friend, often joined her during these listening sessions. He described her as a real character, a gentle and kind soul with a warm heart and a quiet resilience. But on March 29, 2016, something was terribly wrong. It was a typical morning when Barbara, Louise's neighbor, called Miranda in a panic. Louise's car was gone. Barbara wondered if Louise had gone out of town and forgotten to tell her, but Miranda was immediately alarmed. This was entirely out of character. Louise never went anywhere without informing at least one person. Miranda tried calling her mother, but the phone rang straight to voicemail. Panic set in. It wasn't like her mother to not answer, especially after their conversation the day before. Something didn't feel right. Without wasting another moment, Miranda jumped into her car and drove over to Louise's house. She arrived at Barbara's house, parked, and hurried to the door. Barbara was waiting outside, looking just as worried. The two of them went inside the house, but everything was eerily quiet. Miranda called out to her mother, but there was no response. She glanced around, spotting her mother's purse on the couch, along with Ziploc bags that Louise always kept in her purse, now empty. It was when Miranda made her way down the hall that her unease grew into something worse. She noticed the bathroom door was shut. That struck her as odd. Louise never closed the bathroom door. She approached slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. When she opened it, she was met with a nightmare. Louise was lying in the bathtub, her body drenched in blood. Her throat had been slit, and there were 98 stab wounds all over her body. Miranda's blood ran cold. This was not the mother she had known. This wasn't a natural death. This was a brutal, violent murder. Miranda immediately called 911, her voice shaking as she reported what she had found. "I don't know what happened. Her car's gone, and I came over. I found her in the bathroom." Her words trailed off, unable to comprehend the horror that had unfolded in the house she had visited so many times. Within minutes, emergency responders arrived, followed by the first officers on the scene. Detective Bryce Minter was quickly assigned to the case. When he stepped into the bathroom, the scene was as violent as it was chaotic. Blood was splattered everywhere, covering the floor, the walls, and the tub. The brutality of the murder was immediately clear. Detective Minter turned to Miranda, who was visibly shaken but still trying to hold it together. "Was there anything unusual in the days leading up to this?" he asked gently. Miranda paused, her mind racing, trying to piece together the fragments of what was happening. "No," she said slowly. I spoke to her yesterday. We were fine. Everything seemed normal. She wasn't seeing anyone, no visitors, nothing out of the ordinary. But there was something Miranda couldn't shake: Louise's missing purse and cell phone. Neither were in their usual place. When the detectives asked Miranda about the missing items, she confirmed that it was highly unusual for her mother to be without them. It didn't make sense. Was this a robbery gone wrong? But then why take her car? Why was the violence so intense? The police set about collecting evidence. They scoured the house for clues, trying to find any sign of forced entry or anything that could give them a lead. But everything inside the house seemed undisturbed. There was no sign of a struggle, nothing that pointed to a break-in. It was as if the murderer had been allowed to come inside, unchallenged. The next logical step was to track down Louise's missing car. The investigators put out an alert for it, hoping to find something that could lead them closer to the killer. But there was no immediate sign of it. The case was becoming more complicated by the minute. As Detective Minter walked through the house, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something. Whoever had done this had planned it. It wasn't a random act of violence. It was personal. The brutality of the crime suggested that there was more to this than just a robbery or random attack. There was a story behind it, and he intended to find out what it was. The phone call from Barbara to Miranda had been enough to raise alarm bells. The moment Miranda arrived at Louise Dickey's house, the tension in the air was palpable. Her mother's car was gone, and no one had heard from her. Miranda let herself into the house, calling out for her mother, but there was no response. As she walked through the living room, she noticed her mother's purse on the couch, a sign that something wasn't right. The purse, along with the Ziploc bags that were always there, lay abandoned. Miranda's heart began to race as she made her way down the hall. She reached the bathroom, the door shut tight. It was unusual. Louise never closed the bathroom door. Not once in Miranda's entire life had she known her mother to keep it shut. With growing dread, she turned the handle and pushed the door open. What she found was beyond anything she could have prepared for. Her mother's lifeless body lay in the bathtub, covered in blood. Louise Dickey, the woman who had always greeted her with a warm smile, was now a victim of something brutal and incomprehensible. 98 stab wounds. Her throat had been slit. The violence of it was overwhelming. Miranda stood frozen for a moment, the sight searing into her memory. It took her a moment to process what she was seeing. And then, instinct kicked in. She grabbed her phone and called 911, her voice shaking. "My mother's been... she's dead. In the bathroom. She's been stabbed." The operator's calm tone was the only thing that kept her grounded as the reality of the situation began to sink in. The police arrived within minutes, but by the time they were on the scene, the shock of the discovery had set the tone for the investigation. Detective Bryce Minter arrived at the house shortly thereafter, stepping through the front door and straight into the crime scene. The blood in the bathroom was everywhere. The walls, the floor, the tub. It was a clear sign of the sheer violence involved. As Detective Minter looked around, he noted the absence of forced entry. The front door was locked. There were no broken windows. The house had not been ransacked. Nothing appeared to be missing, except Louise's car, her phone, and her purse. It didn't make sense. Louise wasn't wealthy. There was no reason for a random robbery to end like this. The scene was a puzzle, one that didn't fit any typical pattern. The violence, the lack of any other sign of a struggle. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. Whoever had done this knew Louise, and they had come with the intent to kill. Detective Minter's first question to Miranda was simple. "Do you know of anyone who would want to hurt your mother?" Miranda shook her head, still in disbelief. "No, no one. She was kind. She helped people, always." The answer, of course, didn't bring any clarity. Louise wasn't the type to make enemies. But the absence of the car, the purse, and the phone, there was something more here. Minter felt it. Something was off. This wasn't just about a woman found dead in her own home. This was personal. The first major lead came when the police discovered Louise's car was missing. The absence of the vehicle confirmed that Louise hadn't just gone somewhere on her own. Whoever had killed her had likely stolen the car after the murder, and now the focus shifted to finding it. A bolo, the be on the lookout, was issued immediately. The car, a gold 1998 Buick Park Avenue, was distinctive, and if it was still in use, it might lead them directly to the killer. Minutes turned into hours, and Detective Minter continued to investigate, gathering statements from Miranda and others. But nothing new surfaced. No one had seen anything unusual. No one had heard anything. The neighborhood, typically quiet, was now under the microscope. Then the call came in. An officer on patrol had spotted the Buick in a convenience store parking lot several miles away. The car had been parked there overnight. The officer noted that the store had a security camera facing the parking lot, so Detective Minter rushed to the scene. They reviewed the footage from the store's cameras. It was grainy, but clear enough to show the car pull into the parking lot. A young man stepped out of the car. He appeared in his early 20s, dark-haired, wearing a jacket. The video showed him walking towards the convenience store. Detective Minter zoomed in, but the footage wasn't high-defensive minute, making it difficult to capture any fine details about the suspect's appearance. Inside the store, the man briefly interacted with a clerk. They exchanged a few words, nothing that stood out. After a couple of minutes, he left, returning to Louise's car. He didn't seem in any kind of rush, as if he was simply running errands. No blood was visible on his clothes or hands, which was odd considering the nature of the crime. For a moment, the detectives wondered if they had the wrong person. Perhaps this was just someone who had found the car and was using it to run errands. But something didn't sit right. The next break came when the man was seen attempting to use Louise's ATM card at a nearby machine. The footage showed him trying to withdraw money, but the transaction failed. He seemed to grow frustrated. He fiddled with the card, trying again, but still no success. He left the ATM and walked back to the car. There was nothing about his movements that screamed panic or guilt. He got back into the car and, for a moment, just sat there. The calmness was unsettling. Then, the detectives reviewed another piece of footage. A car pulled into the parking lot to pick up the man. The car, a dark Ford Focus, was not a car they had identified before. But it was important because it appeared to be the vehicle the suspect had been dropped off in. The man got into the passenger side of the Ford Focus and they drove away. The footage from this camera wasn't enough to make out a license plate, but the detectives had caught a break. The hubcaps on the Ford Focus were missing. A small detail, but it was something. Detective Minter stared at the footage again, the grainy image of the man standing by the ATM replaying in his mind. The man had stepped into the convenience store with calm, deliberate movements, just after attempting to withdraw money from Louise Dickey's ATM. There was no sign of panic, no sense of guilt in the way he moved. He was too clean, too composed for someone who had just brutally murdered a woman. The violence of the crime demanded a reaction, yet this man appeared untouched by it. The footage showed the man walking into the store, shaking hands with the cashier. They exchanged a few words, but nothing stood out. After a brief interaction, he left the store, walking calmly back to Louise's Buick. He got into the driver's seat, sat there for a while, and then exited the car again, returning to the store. Minter couldn't shake the sense that something was off. Why was he lingering? What was he doing? The man didn't seem like he was running from anything, but there was something else, something that felt wrong. The clock was ticking. Every passing minute without a break meant the suspect was getting farther away. Minter replayed the footage, focusing on every detail. The man's clean appearance was unsettling. He had no visible signs of having been involved in a violent murder just hours earlier, yet here he was, walking through the store, casually interacting with the employees, acting as if nothing had happened. The sheer calmness in his movements made Minter uneasy. He wasn't just a random thief. Louise's car had been stolen after the murder, but it wasn't about the car. It wasn't about the money either. There was something more personal going on here, something deeper. The way the man walked back to the Buick and then into the store again was not how someone acting under the pressure of a crime would behave. The surveillance footage showed the man walking away from Louise's Buick and getting into a Ford Focus that had pulled up. The Ford Focus was not in the earlier footage, but this car was linked directly to the suspect. The man had been picked up by someone, but the footage was too blurry to make out who was driving. However, Minter was sure of one thing. The man wasn't acting alone. The Ford Focus pulled into the parking lot shortly after the man had exited the Buick. He got into the passenger seat and the car drove off. Minter could barely make out the license plate, but the car's distinctive features stood out. The missing hubcap on the passenger side was a small but telling detail. The missing hubcap was a brake. It wasn't much, but it was enough to latch onto. As the investigation progressed, the ATM records confirmed that the man had indeed used Louise's bank card to withdraw money. It wasn't the first time the card had been used. Earlier that day, it had been used at Walgreens just before the murder. The footage from Walgreens showed Louise walking alongside the man, both entering the store together. They seemed relaxed, calm, like old friends. They were in and out of the store quickly, purchasing some items before leaving. There was nothing to suggest that anything had been amiss between them. They were simply shopping. Nothing in their interaction showed any sign of trouble, but it was all too normal. Miranda watched the footage, her face blank, unable to identify the man. I don't know who he is," she said, shaking her head. "I've never seen him before." But Barbara, Louise's neighbor, immediately recognized the man. When Barbara was shown the footage, she stared for a moment before her face fell. "That's Corey," she said, voice trembling. "That's my nephew, Corey King." The name hit like a hammer. Corey King, a 26-year-old from Kansas City. Barbara had never mentioned his name much, but now she realized that he had been in and out of Louise's life. He had asked to stay at Louise's house a few times before, but Louise had always refused. Something had changed that night. Barbara hadn't heard from him in a while, but now it seemed that he had been involved in the Louise's murder. Minter felt the weight of the discovery. Corey King was the man they were looking for. The team quickly issued a be on the lookout for Corey King. They now had a name to connect to the crime. The next step was finding him. They dug into Corey's background and discovered a pattern of substance abuse and petty crimes. He had been to rehab multiple times, but had never stayed clean for long. He was a man with a history of troubled behavior, someone who had a strained relationship with his family. Minter instructed his team to focus on tracking Corey King's last known location. The most promising lead was the Ameristar Casino, where Corey's phone had been tracked. Louise's phone had pinged the area just hours before the murder was discovered. Minter and his team arrived at the casino just after 3 a.m., hoping to catch Corey before he fled the area. But when they arrived, Corey was nowhere to be found. However, the casino's surveillance cameras had picked him up. The footage showed Corey walking around the casino floor. He seemed calm, talking to someone just outside the frame. He wasn't alone. A woman was following him, and Minter couldn't shake the feeling that this was the same woman seen driving the Ford Focus. The two of them had left the casino and walked toward the ATM. Corey attempted to use Louise's card again, but the transaction failed. The footage showed him becoming frustrated, but there was no sense of urgency. He wasn't running, wasn't trying to escape. He was just trying to get money, trying to access whatever he could. 4:08 a.m., Corey was seen leaving the casino, walking out with the woman. The Ford Focus was parked outside. It seemed as though they had been waiting for him. Minter ordered his team to follow their movements. The car pulled out of the casino parking lot, but just as it reached the exit, it stopped. After a brief pause, the car turned left instead of right, an unusual decision. Minutes later, Corey King and the woman were traced to a motel just outside the city. Minter knew they were closing in. The pieces were falling into place. Corey was their man. They had tracked his movements from the moment he had used Louise's bank card, and now they had him. It was only a matter of time before he would be arrested. The arrest came quietly. Corey King didn't resist when the police knocked on the motel door. He seemed almost numb, detached, as if he knew this moment would come. Detective Minter and his team moved quickly, securing the motel room and bringing him in for questioning. Once they sat him down in the interrogation room, Minter began calmly. Corey, we know you were at Louise Dickey's house that night. We know you used her bank card at multiple locations. We know you tried to take her money. What happened?" For a long time, Corey said nothing. He stared at the table, his hands shaking slightly, as if processing everything he was about to say. Then his voice cracked. I didn't mean for it to go this far," he muttered. Minter leaned forward. "Start from the beginning. What happened that night?" Corey exhaled sharply, as if the weight of the truth had been crushing him all along. He told them that he had been high on marijuana and Xanax when he arrived at Louise's house. He had argued with her about staying on her couch for the night, but she refused. He had pleaded with her, insisting he couldn't leave due to the drugs in his system, but she wouldn't let him stay. I snapped," Corey whispered. "I grabbed a box cutter from the kitchen, and when she wouldn't let me stay, I slit her throat." There was no hesitation in his voice now. The admission was chilling, as though the weight of the crime had become too much to carry. "I didn't stop there," he continued. "I dragged her into the bathroom. She was still breathing, just barely. I took another knife and stabbed her again and again." Minter's stomach turned. This was what he had been fearing. The brutality of the crime was beyond comprehension. Corey admitted to stealing Louise's phone, her debit card, prescription medication, and the keys to her car. He had driven off in the stolen car, trying to access Louise's money at the ATM, but the transactions had failed. I don't know what came over me," Corey said, his voice breaking. "I never meant to kill her. I lost control." The interrogation room was silent, except for the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Corey King's confession had laid the case bare, but the damage had already been done. The detectives left the room, their minds racing, their hearts heavy with the brutal details of the crime. Corey had admitted to everything: the murder, the stabbing, the robbery, the way he had taken Louise's car and used her bank card. It had all started with an argument over something as simple as a place to sleep, but it had ended with the death of a woman who had always been kind to him. Detective Minter felt a pang of frustration as they processed Corey King. The case was essentially closed, but no matter how much evidence there was, the senselessness of it all lingered. Louise Dickey was dead, and Corey King had destroyed not only her life, but the lives of everyone who had cared for her. Corey King was charged with first-degree murder and armed criminal action. The courts moved quickly, and within weeks he was arraigned. The defense had no argument. Corey's guilt was undeniable, and the evidence was overwhelming. It was clear that the murder was premeditated, driven by his need for shelter and the influence of drugs. He had been a danger to himself and others long before that night, and now there were no more excuses. The trial was quick. Corey King pled guilty to the charges. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder of Louise Dickey, and an additional life sentence for armed criminal action, which would run concurrently. There would be no second chances for Corey King. His fate was sealed. For Miranda, the emotional toll was devastating. Her mother was gone, and nothing in the world could bring her back. The grief she felt was overwhelming, but in the aftermath of the trial, she found a small measure of closure. The murderer was behind bars. Corey King had confessed to what he had done. The justice system had worked, but it didn't change the fact that Louise Dickey was never coming back. Miranda and her mother's close friends held the memorial service for Louise, a quiet ceremony with a few close family members. They remembered Louise for who she was, a kind woman who loved her cats, her family, and the simple joys in life. Miranda gave a eulogy, trying to hold back tears as she spoke of her mother's gentle nature, the woman who had always been there for her. It was a goodbye she never thought she'd have to say. As for Barbara, Louise's neighbor, the loss of her dear friend weighed heavily on her as well. She was still in shock over how someone she had known, someone from her own family, had been capable of such violence. Barbara had been the one to recognize Corey King in the surveillance footage, and though she was relieved that the case had been solved, she struggled with the fact that her nephew had been the one to commit the crime. In the end, the case of Louise Dickey's murder left a scar on the community. It was a small, quiet neighborhood where people rarely locked their doors, but after the brutal killing, things would never be the same. The violent act, committed by someone so close to Louise, had shaken everyone to their core. The community mourned the loss of a kind woman whose life had been taken too soon. Miranda moved on, eventually finding peace with the memories of her mother. But she would never forget the last few weeks, the terror of finding her mother's body, the pain of the investigation, and the hard, cold truth of Corey King's confession.